I recently asked viewers to send in games of theirs that they're really proud of. And thank you everyone that's done that. Thank you for taking the trouble to send in your games. And over the next few weeks, I'm going to show a few of these games. I think they're really instructive and some really nice games as well. So I received this game and it came with this message. So let me read the message and it'll put the game in context. Hello Daniel, my name is Victor Stefan. I'm a chess player from Greece and I really love your work. Okay, that's a good start to a message. I like that. Your videos and PowerPlay series have been incredibly helpful all these years and I believe they've contributed to improving my game a great deal. Well, that's really nice to hear and that's a good follow-up to the message. Okay, I like this guy already. I'd like to send you a game I played last summer in an open tournament, classical time control, in Crete, against a FIDE master from France, Sohier, featuring this G5 idea. Ah yes, I've shown quite a few games that feature an early G5 from black recently, so this is going to be another one. It's kind of outrageous, this game, and brilliant. Where are we? I think it's an interesting and frankly quite funny game because out of the 28 moves it lasted, 24 are just knight and pawn moves, and in the final position almost all my pieces are on the back rank. Well, that's a really intriguing introduction to this game. So let's take a look at it. So Sohier from France against Victor Stefan from Greece, played in the summer of 2022. So knight c3, it's going to be some variety of closed Sicilian. And white goes for bishop b5. Quite a trendy move at the moment. The idea of this, it's a kind of hybrid between the Rossolimo and the Grand Prix attack. The idea is to exchange on c6 and only then go for a Grand Prix attack, pushing the f-pawn. Notice white has delayed the development of the knight on f3. And exchanging off bishop for knight here really increases the strength of this kingside attack because black can't use the outpost. Therefore, black's reply here is very logical. I discussed this in my anti-Sicilians course for Chessable. If you want the details of this line, then do check out my anti-Sicilians course. I'll leave the link down there somewhere. The logical reply for black is to play knight d4. I mean, in so many variations of the closed Sicilian, where white has a knight on c3, this is where black's knight belongs, on the outpost d4. I mean, it's such a good central square. That knight just looms over the ramparts into white's position. It also leaves this bishop kind of dangling on b5. So knight d4 has to be the right move. Knight f3. And now e6. Now, white should not exchange on d4, because after the knight moves, queen g5 hits the bishop and the pawn on g2. So instead, white castles. And now that bishop can be pushed back. Goes back to d3, not a beautiful square. And now white wants to exchange on d4 and put the knight back here. So knight c6 is actually, it looks strange to go back and forth, but this is actually a very logical move. And yeah, played in many games. So this is one of the main lines of this opening. Now recently I showed you a game by Chicago Dave that went bishop e2 and then this outrageous move g5. And it worked out extremely well for Chicago Dave. In this game, white played b3, which is one of the main lines. In my Chessable course, I recommended g6 in this position. So the e5 and d4 squares are really key, those key central squares in this opening. And it's logical to put the bishop on the long diagonal here. And then, well, white really doesn't have much better than to exchange bishops. And then, having got rid of that dark squared bishop, it's sensible to put the pawns on dark squares and set up like this. And strategically, this is very sound. So, having put the pawns on dark squares, then this bishop has freedom to come out somewhere on this diagonal. And black is really solid here. So I think that's a very sound way for black to play. But Victor played g5. There we go. We've got our g5 move again. Let's go. And I mean, in some ways, with the same idea, you want to put the bishop on g7 on this lovely diagonal. But this one has a little bit of extra spice because perhaps we can push that knight back, which gives black even more control over these squares. And that starts to cramp white's king. And at the moment, because the centre, there's not a lot going on in the centre, black's king is actually okay. Its position is closed. So, you know, you can actually get away with a move like g5. So white plays bishop b2 and bishop g7. And now, yeah, how does white deal with this? You know, this is not easy. Black just wants to push, or black could simply develop the queenside, because actually seems to me that castling queenside for black here could be a very good option. So white plays knight a4, exchanging off those bishops. I think that's very reasonable. And black pushes the g-pawn. The knight has to go back, and that's where you can see that knight at the moment just doesn't have a good square to go to. And it really just gets in the way on the first rank. Here Victor played knight f6, developing a piece. It's hard to criticise developing a knight to a very natural square, but actually I think it's better to play h5. As we'll see, black actually loses time with that knight in a minute. And it could well be that the knight is better placed on e7 and then d5. I think this is just a very double-edged position. It's also sometimes nice to have this diagonal open. But yeah, really it's about moving this knight to e7 then d5. So knight f6 played. And yeah, here's the slight problem, because after f4, well, you don't really want to take. That feels hazardous. So d6, a4, well, that's sort of directed against this expansion. h5 comes anyway. c3, so this is looking perhaps to just push the bishop back and then advance with d4. So d5, yeah, black stakes a claim in the middle of the board. I mean, I guess another way to play might be to play b6 and bishop b7, but d5 anyway. e5, and the knight has to go backwards. So yeah, this knight has lost a little time. As I said, I think it would have been better to play knight e7 originally and then d5. And this is a really important moment in the game. Here, white makes, I think, a fundamental error. To my eyes, there's a very natural move for white in this position. Look at this knight. It just gets in the way. It has to move off the back rank. Otherwise, this just, you know, it just disturbs the connection between the major pieces. The only move I would look at in this position is knight c2. And the game goes on, and it's extremely double-edged. Could be that, well, who knows where this king is going to go to. It's a really intriguing position. But I suspect that the reason that white rejected knight c2 was because of c4. So this didn't happen. Knight c2 wasn't played. But I suspect that white was worried about this. Notice this opens up this diagonal. But something tells me that when the queen is going to come down here, this is incredibly risky, particularly with black's king in the middle. And I think if white had delved just a little deeper into this, then he would have realized that just taking that pawn is good for white. Because after the check, king goes in the corner, queen takes b2. It just feels really perilous to have that queen down there. Now, white is a piece down, but there are so many potential tries to upset black here. I mean, one move that strikes me straight away is simply c5. Means the queen can't retreat here, and the threat is just to play queen e2 and rook b1 trapping the queen. So, I mean, there are various ways black can try and shake out of that, but it's certainly worth looking at. Another very natural move is to take on d5. Well, that has to be recaptured. Then play rook b1, so that stops the queen retreating here. And then go queen e2. So there's a couple of things going on. Now there's a threat to play rook here and rook b1. Taking this I don't think makes a difference. That's the queen drops. So that already looks really serious. Not quite sure how the queen is getting out. And the other thing is that white has just a steaming attack here because it really isn't clear where that king is going. It won't be safe on the queen side, it won't be safe on the king side, and it isn't safe in the middle. So I don't know, just a little bit more exploration of those lines would have been helpful to white, because it just feels to me like this move, knight c2, is really the only move that white should be looking at in this position. Instead, clearly white thought, okay, it might be a good idea just to stop this one. And c4 was played, but that leaves two gaping holes in the position on d4 and b4. I think black has lots of good moves here. You could simply just develop, but, well, yeah, sorry, knight e7 was played. I beg your pardon. Yeah, that was played and a good move. King h1 and knight here. It's a fantastic square. And I think already, you know, white is sort of panicking a little bit. I mean, instead of king h1, I guess knight c2 was a better move anyway, but even so, I don't know, this just doesn't feel right at all, weakening these squares. But after king h1, knight d4, and that discourages white from playing knight c2 because this pawn is on. So notice this knight isn't coming out for a bit, basically. And white's next move is a bit desperate. White decided to give up a pawn. I mean, I think the thing is with this position, black has so many, a very clear idea to develop this queen's bishop, probably on the long diagonal, and then perhaps castle queenside, but basically look to attack on the king side like this. So I think, you know, white got a bit panicky, and that was taken. So now black is a pawn up. It's a very healthy pawn. Knight c2. Finally, that knight comes off the back rank, but this looks very promising for black now. I think, let me see, I didn't look at this earlier. If knight takes pawn, I'm guessing that in this case, queen b6 could be rather embarrassing. Looks nasty. So knight here played, bishop takes knight. So white attempting to exchange pieces to somehow, minimize the danger, the damage. But this is really nicely played by black now. d4. So that really forces an exchange. And this turns out extremely well for black. A5, trying to claim some squares. H4, watch what's going on here. And H3. Well, understandably, white wanted to close the H file. That could be too dangerous. So white played G3. But just look at this. Wow. Fantastic pawn chain. And now white's king is open. And in spite of having all these pieces on the back rank, all in their starting positions, I think we can say that black has a winning strategic advantage here because white's king is so weak. In fact, this pawn chain, this reminds me of 2 games played in Geneva 1996 between Vishy Anand and Garry Kasparov. Geneva 96, do check them out. They actually came from a Najdorf. That's another story. I might have to show those games another time. And black's next move, very cool. Castle's kingside. I mean, I would be in a rush to bring the queen and the bishop to this long diagonal. But this is really cool because it just avoids any nonsense with, a queen check and no complications actually. Knight takes b4 and b5. There you go. That just prepares to bring the bishop to the long diagonal. And white is utterly lost now. c5. Tempting to sort of close things, but this is too little too late. Here black played bishop b7, which is a good move. d3 is even more emphatic because once the queen comes here, hitting that one, this just wins material. There's absolutely no defense. Hitting the knight, wanting to come here. But anyway, bishop b7 is certainly a very strong move as well. And of course, if c6, that can just be taken. And queen d5 check. So king g1. And black played d3 and white resigned. So the idea is queen d4 check, which is a very embarrassing move for black. White can play on a little bit. c6 keeps white in the game for a few moves. Check, but this is still should be winning for black. After this, pawn takes bishop and rook b8. So black is going to pick up that pawn. So black is then a whole pawn up, and with the queen on one of these squares is dominating the position. White is never going to escape when the king is stuck like this, and black's pieces will coordinate beautifully and that pawn will be pushed. And yeah, it's a winning position for black. So really nice game from Victor Stefan. Thank you very much for sending the game in, Victor. Let's just, run through things. G5, I think is a really serious alternative to G6 here. I rather like this move. And we've seen this kind of strategy cramping white's king in, several games I've showed. And notice how, black's strategy worked out perfectly by the end. This pawn storm really just cramped the king beautifully. But from white's point of view, I think this was basically poor judgment. I think white got spooked by this idea of c4 and overreacted by playing c4 himself. Whereas I think just a little bit of calm would have... I think white would have seen that actually c4 isn't very good. And yeah, the move has to be knight c2. And then it's just a very double-edged position. But as I said, really well played by Victor Stefan. And I'll be showing you more games from you over the next couple of weeks. Thanks for watching.